The first sound was not a scream. It was a measured noise, low and rasped, like someone had decided begging was a waste of oxygen and was now counting pain. The way miners count hours one breath at a time. Cale Rourke killed his crawler's lights and listened again. The desert wind tugging at the antenna mast. 3 chalk-white moons hung over Dunemarkex, making the sand look like bone dust. Cale had been running salvage routes for so long he'd started talking to his own shadow. Out here, you didn't find people. People found you. He throttled the crawler forward, tires whispering over grit. The vehicle was an old 6-wheeled bruiser with mismatched panels and a personality that consisted mostly of spite. He'd named it Mags because it kept pulling him toward trouble like a magnet. Mag's sensors had pinged with an electromagnetic anomaly sharp. Irregular spikes like a heart monitor having an argument. Those readings meant one of 2 things: valuable wreckage or someone's expensive mistake. Cale preferred wreckage. Wreckage didn't look at you with eyes that made you remember you still had a conscience. The sound came again, closer now. Leaking out of a wash between 2 rust-colored stone towers the settlers called the Fangs. Cale parked behind a ridge, slipped out with his rifle slung low, and crept down into the shallow ravine. He found her half buried in sand, braced on one elbow. Teeth clenched so hard the muscles in her jaw stood out like cable. She was enormous, not bulky built. 7 feet of compact power, skin a deep dusk violet that drank in moonlight. Hair the color of molten wheat spilling in a tangled sheet over shoulders. That could have carried his crawler if she felt like it. Her left leg was caught in a spined clump the size of a small table military hardware, the kind designed to pin megafauna for study. Someone had modified it. Blue-white arcs snapped along the rim in rhythmic pulses, and every pulse drove her body rigid, like a puppet yanked by invisible strings. The air smelled of hot metal and copper. The sand around the trap was darkened by blood, not red, but a rich purple-black like crushed berries. She saw him and moved immediately, not toward him, not away toward the blade strapped to her thigh. Her hand trembled, whether from shock or exhaustion or fury. Cale couldn't tell. That alone told him everything. She'd been trapped long enough to accept death, but not long enough to accept surrender. Cale raised both hands, palms open. "Easy," he said, voice pitched low. "I'm not here to finish what the trap started." Her eyes tracked him as he edged closer. Pale ice blue, to bright against her skin, set in a face that carried the fine angles of her species, the Aurelian clans, but hardened by the kind of life that didn't allow softness to survive. She spoke in her own language first, a string of musical syllables and sharp consonants, like wind chimes thrown at stone. Cale exhaled. "I don't speak that," he said carefully. "But I'm guessing you just offered to rearrange my organs." Her gaze narrowed. Then, to his surprise, she switched to clipped standard with a heavy accent. "Human, old armor, Border Legion issue, retired or runaway?" He almost laughed. 3 years alone, and he still couldn't stop being read like a book. "Retired," Cale said. It was true if you defined retirement as walking away from a war and burying yourself on a planet. Nobody cared enough to map twice. "And I'm going to open that trap." whether you like me or not. Her fingers hovered over her knife hilt. If you touch it wrong, it will kill me. It'll kill you anyway, Kale said, crouching to study the mechanism from a safer angle. The clamp had a blinking indicator-old design, but the new power unit had been welded in with deliberate cruelty. Full discharge in about 7 minutes. When it trips, it doesn't just hold you. It cooks you. She absorbed that with the calm of someone who'd had a long relationship with bad outcomes. Then you die with me. Not my top plan for tonight, Kale muttered. He leaned closer, eyes scanning the corroded release latch. Dried blood crusted the metal. This trap had tasted victims before her recently. Alive captures, he realized. You didn't add a stun cycle unless you wanted the prey alive, which meant cages, transport, buyers. The thought sat heavy in his gut. I'm going to touch the release, Kale said. If you stab me, you still die. If you let me work, you might not. Her eyes held him for a long, brutal moment. Then her hand slid away from her blade. Wise, Kale breathed, more relief than sarcasm. He set to work. The latch fought him, rusted and stubborn, but his fingers remembered old skills. Before the Legion had handed him a rifle, they'd handed him a wrench. He'd spent years fixing siege gates and field generators under fire. Metal had patterns. Pain had patterns too. You are not incompetent, she said, voice tight. For a human, I try, Kale said. What's your name? You ask questions while deciding if you survive. I ask questions because silence makes my hands shake, Kale said. And when my hands shake, traps explode. Something flickered behind her eyes' amusement. Or the ghost of it. I am Seraph of the House Leora, she said at last. Kel's stomach went cold. Even a hermit knew that name. House Leora sat at the center of Aurelian power like a blade balanced on a fingertip. Royals wore blood markers, bone crystal pendants that keyed emergency beacons and marked lineage. She had one at her throat, half buried in sand and hair. Kale had just found Aurelian royalty in a slaver's trap. The universe had a vicious sense of timing. Kale, he said, professional nobody, amateur idiot. Hold still. The latch groaned. Kale braced his shoulder against the clamp housing, counted the pulse intervals, and timed his twist between arcs. One wrong move and the discharge would jump to him. The mechanism clicked. Now, Kale warned. Brace. The clamp jaws peeled back with a wet, grinding sound that made his teeth itch. Seraph gasped her first real sound of vulnerability, and purple blood surged down her calf. In a sudden spill, the injury deep enough that Kale saw pale bone flash in the moonlight. He swore under his breath and yanked a medical pouch from his belt. Coagulant spray hissed over the wound, the chemical stench sharp and clean. He wrapped bandage after bandage, hands moving on pure memory, and injected a pain blocker before she could argue. She hissed when the needle bit. That was unpleasant. Hence the warning, Kale said, trying for lightness and failing. When he finished, her breathing had steadied, but her skin looked too tight around her cheekbone, shock edging in. We need to move, Kale said, scanning the wash. Whoever said this will come back. Seraph pushed herself upright with a strength that made no sense. Even wounded, She moved like a war machine forced to pretend it had limits. Cale offered his shoulder. She took it without gratitude and without pride. Like accepting support was simply a tactical decision. They reached Mags, and Cale boosted her into the cramped passenger bay. She barely fit, her hair brushing the ceiling. As he swung into the driver's seat, he noticed tracks cutting across the sand, 3 sets of human boots. Recent, heading east toward the skeleton of an abandoned mining camp. Somebody was operating out of it. Somebody with military hardware and a taste for live cargo. Cale turned the crawler away from the tracks and pushed the engine hard. His home wasn't a home. It was a prefabricated shelter wedged into a cliff face, half hidden under rock and scrub. Its water recycler wheezed, its power grid sputtered, and the whole thing smelled faintly of soda and stale coffee. But it was defensible, and more importantly, it was invisible. Seraph ducked inside and looked around with an expression that politely tried not to be insulting. "Cozy," Cale said before she could speak. "That's the word I was thinking." "Confined," she said. "I didn't build it for entertaining 7-foot warlords," Cale said, guiding her to the cot. "I'm not a warlord, right? You're just the kind of person slavers set military traps for." Her jaw tightened. Cale cleaned the wound properly this time, wincing when antiseptic made her flinch. She pretended she hadn't. "You heal fast," Cale said, applying a gel accelerant he'd scavenged from a wreck years ago. "A day or 2, and you'll walk without limping. Maybe." "And the men who did this, still breathing," Cale said, "which I'm guessing is your least favorite outcome." Seraph's eyes hardened. "They are traffickers. They take our people and sell them. Pleasure barges, arena pits. Worse, I was hunting them." Cale's gaze flicked to her pendant. "You're not just hunting. You're important." A pause, then a quiet confession. "I am the High Heir, commander of the 3rd Wind Division." Cale let out a slow breath. "Of course you are. You sound displeased." "I sound like a man who spent 3 years building a life with no one in it," Cale said. "And now a royal warrior is bleeding on my bed." Before she could reply, a siren screamed his proximity alert, buried under the workbench. Cale moved on instinct, killing lights, grabbing his rifle from its mount. Through the slit window, dust plumes rolled in from the east, multiple vehicles, fast, low. Military configuration. "How many?" Seraph demanded, already trying to stand. "4. Maybe 5. They tracked you." Cale's jaw clenched. "I was careful." "You were caring," she corrected, grimly. The first blast hit the cliff above the shelter. The whole structure shuddered, dust raining from the ceiling like grit from old bones. Cale grabbed Seraph's arm. "Back hatch," he snapped. "Move." They slipped out into moonlight as a second explosion collapsed the shelter's front wall. Vehicles fanned out, surrounding his little hideout with practiced efficiency. He heard amplified commands, the whine of charged weapons, the crunch of boots on rock. Cale didn't wait to translate intent into regret. He ran. Seraph ran beside him, limping. Yes, but fast enough to make his lungs burn trying to keep pace. He didn't ask what it cost her to do that. Some questions were answered by the way a person's face went to still. The cave mouth was ahead, a narrow seam in the stone. Kale reached it first, turned, and saw Sarith's shoulders. She stopped. "I will not fit." "Yes," Kale said, grabbing her by the forearm and physically rotating her. "Turn sideways. Duck. Don't breathe. Just go." For a heartbeat, she looked like she might argue. Then she did it. Stone scraped her armor, sand and grit falling in little avalanches as she squeezed through with centimeters to spare. Kale followed, shoulders shredding against rock. Behind them came shouts, clothes, now boots striking gravel, weapons charging. The cave widened into a chamber lit by faint bioluminescent fungus. Pale blue glow crawling along the walls like cold fire. It made Sarith's skin look unreal, like dusk given a body. They pushed deeper, twisting through tunnels Kale had explored out of boredom and survival paranoia. He knew the places where the ceiling sagged, the places where a wrong step meant a collapse. They stopped only when their breathing turned ragged and the world narrowed to heartbeat and stone. "They will hesitate," Kale said. Unmapped caves, unstable passages. Sarith leaned against the wall, gaze fixed on him. "Why did you save me?" He stared at the fungus light for a long moment before answering. "Because I'm tired," Kale said at last. "Tired of running. Tired of being the kind of man who watches a bad thing happen and keeps walking." Sarith's voice softened, almost unwillingly. "My people say, the warrior who walks alone dies alone." Kale snorted, breath still shaky. "Comforting. It is not meant to be," she said. "It is meant to be true." A distant echo drifted down the tunnel, voices, moving, searching. "They followed," Sarith said. Kale checked his rifle. "Then we keep moving." Hours blurred into cold stone and tight passages. Twice Kale doubled back through side fissures, laying small charges from his emergency kit. Once, he led their pursuers into a narrow throat of rock and dropped the ceiling behind them with a conter. Old blast that shook dust from the walls and made Sarith grimace. They emerged near dawn on the far side of the ridge, lungs raw, clothes torn, alive by stubbornness more than skill. Sarith's pendant pulsed under her fingers. She activated it with a firm press. The sky answered. Warcraft descended in a roar of engines, hulls painted in Iralian crimson and gold. Ropes dropped. Warriors rappelled down with brutal grace. Medics rushed Sarith, speaking rapid Klantung, hands already assessing her wound. And then the ruler came. He stepped from the largest craft like gravity belonged to him. Massive, deep amethyst skin, hair bound in a braided crown. Eyes the same ice blue as Sarith's size that landed on Kale like a blade tip. Sarith spoke first, fast, controlled, explaining. Kale caught fragment strap, pursuit, honor. The ruler's expression shifted from suspicion to calculation to something that looked dangerously like approval. He addressed Kale in flawless standard. "You saved my child. It wasn't a question." "I found her," Kale said. "I opened the clamp, got her out. Most would not," the ruler said, voice like distant thunder. "Most would trade her location for coin, or flee, or leave her to die." Kale swallowed. "I'm not most." The ruler's gaze raked Kale's battered Legion plates. "Border Legion, engineering corps, You fought at the fall of Grey Cairn. Kell's stomach tightened. That was years ago, and then you vanished, the ruler said. Running from shame or from grief. Kell's mouth went dry. Does it matter? It might, the ruler said softly. Then his tone sharpened. By our oldest law, you have declared bond intent. Kell blinked. I what? Sereth stepped closer, face carefully blank. Father, the law is older than you and I, the ruler cut in. He guarded you, stayed at your side through danger when retreat was possible. This is the declaration of a protector. It makes him eligible. Kell stared at Sereth. Eligible for what? For me, she said, voice quiet. Kell's brain tried to restart. I didn't know your customs. Intent does not matter, the ruler said. Action matters. Kell forced air into his lungs. So if I refuse, you dishonor my house, the ruler said. And tradition demands blood. Sereth's hand touched Kell's arm steady, grounding. The same gesture she'd made in the caves. Walk with me, she said, and led him away from the crowd to the ridge where the first sunlight spilled over rock. Out of earshot, she finally let the mask slip into something like exhaustion. I should have warned you. Would it have changed what I did? Kell asked. Sereth looked at him the way she had in the cave, like she was seeing something unfamiliar and deciding whether it was dangerous. No, she admitted. I don't think it would. Kell nodded once. Then it doesn't matter. Sereth's voice tightened. If you refuse, my father will be required to challenge you. I would try to stop him. I would fail. Kell stared out at the desert, the long sweep of sand that had been his chosen emptiness. He'd come here to be nothing, to feel nothing, to never again care enough to lose. And yet he'd lost anyway, every day, in slow, quiet ways. He looked at Sereth injured, proud, furious at the world, and realized she'd been alone in a way his solitude had only pretended to be. I'm not good at staying, he said. I know, she replied, but you stayed twice. Kell let out a breath that felt like surrender, and relief tangled together. I have a condition. Sereth's brow lifted. You bargain with a house of storms? I bargain with the woman who laughed when she didn't have to, Kell said. The woman who chose to trust me when trusting is a liability. Her expression softened. Just barely. Speak. The traffickers, Kell said. They're still out there. I want them ended. Not chased off, ended. They're hunters, they're handlers, they're buyers. The whole chain. Sereth's mouth curved into a fierce, bright smile that made her look younger and more dangerous at the same time. You asked to join my war. I asked to fight beside you, Kell said, voice hardening. Partner, not prize. She stepped in and hugged him strong enough to crush breath, careful enough not to jostle her own injured leg. For a moment she wasn't heir or commander, just a person who'd been trapped in pain and found a hand instead of a knife. You will regret this, she murmured. Kell gave a shaky laugh against her shoulder. My last 3 years were me arguing with a vehicle named Mags. I'll take complicated. They returned to the ruler together, hands joined. You accept, the ruler said, reading them instantly. Kell met his gaze. I accept. On one condition. The ruler's eyes narrowed dangerously. Kell didn't flinch. The Traffickers. I want authority and resources to dismantle them. The ruler held Kell's stare for a long, loaded moment. Then, slowly, he smiled a terrifying expression that promised both approval and expectation. "Good," he said. "I prefer my family to have teeth." The bonding ceremony happened quickly. Aurelian tradition wasn't a festival of speeches, but a blade-clean vow exchanged in a hall of living crystal, witnessed by a small circle of trusted clan members. Sereth stood in crimson and gold, her injuries hidden beneath ceremonial cloth, her hair braided with sunstones that caught dawn light like fire. Cale spoke the vows in standard, and then again in halting clan syllables, doing his best not to insult anyone by accident. After, as the hall emptied and the air still hummed with the echo of old chants, Sereth found him at the balcony gardens where bioluminescent plants pulsed in slow patterns, like breathing stars. "You survived," she said. "I've survived worse," Cale admitted. "I'm still not sure I pronounced your father's title correctly. That title is untranslatable," she said, and her mouth twitched. "But you were close." Her gaze sharpened again. "Tomorrow you begin with intelligence. Full access, full clearance. We hunt them your way. And you?" "I go with you," she said simply. "We fight together." Cale looked out over the glowing gardens, then back at her, this impossible storm of a woman who had broken into his carefully built emptiness, and refused to let him call it peace. "Okay," he said, feeling the word land like a cornerstone. "Then we start." The Traffickers had been clever. They'd survived inspections, bribes, raids. They'd spread their network across systems like a disease, hiding behind shell crews and false manifests and disposable hired guns. What they hadn't planned for was an Aurelian heir with a personal vendetta and a human engineer who'd spent years learning how to dismantle things built to withstand siege. Cale mapped their communications. He traced money flows through salvage markets and fuel depots. He learned the rhythm of their drops and the shape of their fear. Sereth provided the pressure authority that made informants suddenly remember names, and the quiet, terrifying certainty that if they lied, she would know. It took months. It took bruises and sleepless nights and ambushes that went sideways. It took Cale relearning how to trust someone at his back, and Sereth relearning how to let someone see the cracks in her armor. In the middle of it, Cale learned she snored when she slept on her back. She learned he woke from nightmares with his hands searching for tools that weren't there. They didn't call it love at first. Aurelians didn't waste sacred words on early certainty. But something grew anyway, stubborn and real. The final strike came on an orbital depot skimming the edge of charted space. 22 Traffickers. Dozens of captives, evidence enough to drag buyers into the light. The raid was fast and brutal. When it ended, the captives stood blinking in the harsh bay lights like people waking from a long nightmare and not trusting morning. Cale found Sereth among the smoke and broken restraints, her armor scorched, her eyes bright with exhausted triumph. "It's done," she said. "This branch," Cale corrected, staring at the freed people. "There will be others." Sereth's hand settled on his shoulder, warm and steady. "Then we hunt others." Cale looked at her, at the partner he hadn't wanted. hadn't believed he deserved, and now couldn't imagine surviving without. Together, he said, and somewhere out beyond the station's viewports, 3 pale moons drifted over a desert that no longer felt like a grave. It felt like a beginning,